Hi, it's Liz. I'm super ambivalent about filming this right now, but whatever. I did say every Thursday, so I'm giving you something. This is something. It'll be what it'll be, I guess. I just wanted to talk about what's on my mind lately because I've been watching, like these long-winded response videos to stuff that Jordan Peterson says for some reason. Um, I don't know. I'm not going to defend it. Probably not a good use of my time, but it brings to mind this thing that I've been thinking about for a really long time. So I thought I'd just share a few thoughts, and that's the really stupid false dichotomy that people have. See, I almost said that people have created it in philosophy, but like among people who actually study philosophy, I don't think very many people are confused about this or like frame things this way. Um, but to lay people who want to talk about philosophy, which I mean, guilty. I mean, I haven't really studied philosophy. I've studied formal logic, and I've read some philosophy. I haven't read the like all the sort of foundational stuff though that like philosophy people read. So, you know, disclaimer. But anyway, this idea that there's a dichotomy between objectivity and relativism, and like the idea that either there is one truth that is objectively true, or you live in a totally relativistic universe in which there isn't really any truth. People just sort of create their own meanings and they're all equally valid. And like both of these are things that like people definitely express, like they're real ideas people have for some reason, and they're both so horrible. Well, okay, let me explain myself here. Because I'm definitely of the position that relativism in the way that it's actually meant in philosophy and the concept of objective truth, there's really no contradiction there. Like you can have both. If you haven't picked up on this by now, I'm a Christian. I'm an Orthodox Christian. We're not fundamentalists, but we definitely do have a set of hard and fast beliefs. We have a theology that's, developed, and it's not a free form kind of version of Christianity. So yeah, I do believe in objective truth. But even within, like, even when you're talking about, especially something like theology, how do we what to what extent can we understand that truth? And that's something that's one thing that separates us from a more fundamentalist attitude, is that we see that a human being isn't going to perfectly understand the truth about God. A human being can get closer to that through grace, but it's not intellectual effort alone is not going to get you very far, because God is so far beyond our understanding, and not just our everyday life, but the extent to which our brain can really conceive of things. And of course, he would be, otherwise, he wouldn't be God. For God to be, God must be vastly complex, beyond the complexity of his creation. And as science has marvelously shown us, the creation that we're living in here, this world, is so marvelously complex that we can't understand that even. um there's so many aspects of it that are strange and mysterious and far beyond the understanding of the average person. um so yeah, how could we expect to wrap our minds around God? That just seems absurd and prideful, very hubristic. Imagine that there is a shape, a three-dimensional shape that looks very different at each angle, and you have any number of observers that are trapped within their position, and they can only see what they see. They are all going to have different descriptions and different understandings of what they're seeing, but it's still going to be the same thing. They could all be operating in good faith, giving a very accurate assessment of their perception, and they're all still going to have very different answers. So that's something that can happen with something as simple as a three-dimensional shape. Now imagine something like God. I mean, imagine, okay. I mean, even something, let's even take it down a little bit, just to think of, imagine some abstract idea, like any number of social issues. Social issues are enormously complex. And in order to model them, you have to simplify things a lot because a single human being is extremely complex. So, if we were to imagine abstractly what a social issue looks like, it would be 4 or 5 dimensional, at least. I mean, depending on how exactly we're modeling it in dimensions. I mean, plenty of things might be 100 dimensional, depending on what you're modeling in those dimensions, and you'd have an extraordinary, complex set of information. Now, the more dimensions you add, the more vastly different um, two-dimensional images you can get of that thing that are going to seem completely. I mean, with a three-dimensional thing, I think our minds can put together how, okay, I see how this picture and this picture and this picture could all be the same thing. Like you can envision a three-dimensional thing. You can't envision a 100-dimensional thing. I don't care who you are, you can't do that. But there are so many topics that we talk about that essentially are 100 dimensional. There are going to be many valid ways to model them. There's going to be many valid observations that might even seem contradictory, but only because we are not able to understand the whole picture, not because they really are contradictory. And that's relativism. I mean, that's what relativism is about, how the meaning of something and the interpretation of something can change based on context. And it's not really that there isn't a core meaning or there isn't a whole meaning, but that for an individual observer, the meaning of things, there can be many meanings. But that doesn't mean that all takes are equally valid, though. You can still be wrong. And I think you can still be further or closer to a full understanding. So while there may be many models that do work to describe this very complex data set, some models might be more helpful than others at really for a human being to really understand what's going on, even if they all fit equally well. And some models are going to fit better than others when you look at the bigger picture. Some views of the data are going to be kind of myopic and maybe not very useful. For instance, like when you have a social issue and there's all these different people weighing in on it, some people might just happen to come from a perspective that they don't have very much information really about the issue. Their exposure to it is minimal. Or maybe they are in a very unique position with respect to it, that, the angle that they're seeing on it is one that just isn't applicable to really very many other people at all, and not very meaningful to understand the larger issue. It's still their truth or whatever, right? It's still valid. It's still, they're honest. It's still real, genuine information, but it doesn't meaningfully help other people maybe understand the issue that's being discussed. So, what's my point? I don't know. So, the thing about the objectivity and subjectivity false dichotomy that really gets me, though, is that both poles of that are basically lend themselves to delusion and to pride. And that's because, on the one hand, people who say, there's only one truth, no relativism allowed, those people tend to believe that they have that truth, more or less, right? They They think that they know. You see this kind of hubris in like a guy like Sam Harris, who he is a scientist, and I don't doubt that he's very good at being a scientist. The thing about math and science, and I'll be the first to admit this, and technological stuff, generally STEM, and I have a degree in math. Like I'm not saying this to put down STEM because I love it, but it honestly is a lot simpler than the humanities. Like people that have it backwards, like they think STEM is, and STEM is, maybe more challenging for a lot of people. I don't doubt that. But the reason that STEM fields can be so rigorous and so analytical is because the information they're working with is much simpler. So they can do a lot more complex analysis with it without winding up with some drivel, which is kind of what the humanities run the risk of every time they create too complex of analysis. Which is why everyone laughs at the humanities. But their job is much harder. They're trying to make meaningful generalizations about humans and groups of humans and things that humans do with their minds that go so far beyond, what you do in STEM, which is things you can quantify, things you can define explicitly, however you want. You don't get to do that in the humanities, really. I mean, you can, but it's not like, in math, you can kind of you can define these objects and then just kind of let them exist in space, and see what happens. You don't really get to do that in the humanities. You have to be describing something real if you're going to define something. It has to be a definition that actually works with what's already going on. You don't get to decide what's going on. You have to actually understand these deeply complex processes, or try to. You have to try to find some sort of useful way to talk about these, yeah, just much more complex things that humans are doing, especially with the hard sciences. And again, I'm not saying they're simple, but they are much simpler in the sense that what you're working with is often fairly discrete things that can be quantified, things that can be broken down into components that are very understandable. That's maybe less true of like quantum physics, but all of those have the language of explicit math that you can use to describe them. With the humanities, like, I mean, you can use statistical models, but there's a lot of, unless you're looking at medical issues, there's a lot of pitfalls with using statistical analysis on groups of humans. My point is that it's very disturbing to me to see this movement of scientists who are beginning to think that because they can come up with concrete answers with respect to these really quite simple and concrete, relatively easy to analyze in a rigorous way objects like atoms and cells and numbers and stuff, that they can then just use those same kinds of methods to derive meaning. So, yeah, there's just a great degree of hubris that goes into, it can be very easy to believe that you're right about things. We're all very good at that. And what are you going to do? Take your own word for it? Oh, say that you have this evidence. I mean, you can't really have evidence for a value, though. It doesn't even make sense. And it's not just scientists who go to this kind of pride about their own sense of objectivity. Obviously, it's also religious fundamentalists, and they tend to create very rigid ideas about not just what's true in an abstract sense, or even what's true in a concrete sense, but also how exactly we should live our lives, exactly which things we should do and which things we shouldn't, in very strict, rigid ways. On the other hand, of course, there's these people who increasingly believe that there isn't essentially any truth or meaning, and that We just have to create our own meaning. And whatever, however things feel to us is, whatever feels good, we should just do that. And of course, there's a lot of pride in that too, because rather at that point, rather than believing that you just are so objective, you are seeing what's true, instead, you're believing that you can decide what's true. And both are really dangerous and both are really prideful. I think what is best is if we recognize that the truth exists and try to get closer to it. And the first step to doing that is to recognize that we don't know. We don't know it, at least not in its fullness. I'm not an agnostic. I don't believe that the truth is unknowable about anything, but I do think the fullness of the truth is unknowable. We only ever have part, we only ever have a certain angle on it. And some of what we have that we think is the truth almost certainly is some kind of illusion. And that I realize that's an unsettling thought. It's a lot more unsettling than either one of these polls, which is perhaps why it's less popular these days. But it requires us to listen and to humble ourselves, to learn from others, but also to guard ourselves against falsehood, to learn to find in ourselves the ability to discern between what's true and what's false through our experience in life and through grace. So that's what I was thinking about today. I hope, whatever. You like it. Bye.